Hello dear viewer and learner, welcome to your favorite program, The Knowledge Quest. It is time for History and Government, and I'm your teacher, Mr. Alex Obara. Our topic today shall be the food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world. Previously, we have been discussing about agrarian revolution, and we realized that agrarian revolution largely has taken place or took place in Britain and the USA. But the question was, what about Africa and the rest of the third world countries? So our topic will be food situation, food in Africa rest of the third world. So before we go into detail, it's important to understand what we mean when we talk about the third world. Africa falls to be among the countries we refer, all the continents we refer as third world. So what is third world? Third world refers to countries which are still developing. They are not less developed, but they are developing. They have not reached at the mark point. You can say they are developed or industrialized, but they are in the process, or they are still in the process of developing. And according to the statistics, third world countries live in the limits of $2 a day. That is, Kenyan shillings is 200. People live on less than 200 shillings a day. Among the continents, we can say, which belong to the third world, we have Africa, we have Asia, we have South America, so these are countries we can say, or these are continents which you can say, or which belong to the third world. They are still in the process of developing. Now, what is the causes of food shortage in Africa? Now, Africa belonging to the countries of the world, the third world. What are the causes of food shortage? Last time we discussed some of the causes, and I'd like us to quickly go through them, and as we shall be completing on the causes of the food shortage in Africa. So our subtopic in that case will be causes of food shortage in Africa. Is Africa undergoing a greater revolution, or is it not? Why do we have food shortage in Africa? So that means the causes, food shortage in Africa, causes to food shortage in Africa. So we will quickly go through them because we discussed some of these causes. The first one we said last time was rapid population growth. Rapid population growth. So this implies that the rate at which the population of Africans are growing is high, and compared to the available resources which are a bit low. Therefore, that leads to shortage. So we realize that there is more population which is competing with the in terms of food, and that actually leads to food shortage in Africa. Number two, we said we have poor land use and agricultural practices. Poor land use and agricultural practices. And like we said last time, Africans still are practicing the Stone Age practices, which were actually carried long time ago. For example, some countries, some farmers in Africa are still using stones. They are still using sticks. They are still using those crude kind of tools in agriculture. And you realize the poor land usage, for example, they don't use pesticides. Those are farming practices which are poor. They don't use fertilizers. There is no mechanization of farms. And in that essence, there is poor production. This leads to food shortage in Africa. Number 3, we have adverse weather conditions. Adverse. We discussed about this and said we have adverse weather conditions. And we said that if we experience rainfall, it is good. But when we experience rainfall to extreme, it becomes flooding. And when we also experience sunny days to extremes, it becomes drought. So you realize that we experience these extreme weather conditions or adverse, which lead to shortage. So when we have flooding, it destroys the crops or the agricultural, in that case, products. Also, when we have drought, the production level goes low, and in essence, we have little production. So that becomes another cause of food shortage in Africa. Then we have overemphasis on cash crop production. Overemphasis on cash crop production at the expense of food production. At the expense of food crops. So you realize that most Kenyans or most Africans in that case overdepend so much. They go for cash crops, crops like tea, talk about crops like sisal, talk about crops like sugarcane. Those are not food crops. So you realize much of the land has been put on production of cash crops at the expense of food crops. And this, in essence, brings about food shortage. And therefore, you realize that Africans probably are more interested in money as compared to food. And therefore, that brings about shortage of food. Then he talked about another effect to be rural urban migration. And this, in essence, we said it affects the young population who are energetic. So they'll move from the rural areas to look for probably white-collar jobs in urban centers. And what happens in essence that we lack labor which is needed to produce more food in rural areas. So therefore that brings about what we call shortage of food production, because we don't have enough manpower from the young people who are energetic who move to urban centers to look for greener pastures in that case. And then the next one we said was lack of adequate capital, or we talk about low income. Low income. So third world countries, we have said they survive on less than $2 a day. So these $2, what are we going to use this money? Are we going to buy farm products, or are we going to buy food for survival? In that case, you realize that there is no money, actually enough money to buy to purchase farm inputs like fertilizers, to purchase farm inputs like machinery, which are required in the farm. Therefore, that leads to poor production, which in essence leads to actually shortage of food in Africa. So that is another factor which we can talk about. Now, the next point, we talk about political instability. Political instability. Most of African countries are facing political upheavals. The temperatures in politics are high. And therefore, that means that we won't have a suitable environment to carry out agriculture. Case at hand, Kenya, we have experienced during the post-election violence in 2007, 2008. So when we have political instability, even external investors would want to come and invest in the field of agriculture will be scared to, because there is no peace in such a country or in African countries. So political instability, we have countries like Ethiopia, Sudan, DR Congo, Burundi, and of course you remember the most common genocide we had, the Rwanda genocide. Those are brought about as a result of political instability, and this leads to food shortage in Africa. Then we have also decline in growing drought-resistant crops. Now, because of what we have called poor attitude, Africans are not interested in growing drought-resistant crops. They prefer the crops which are not drought-resistant. So examples of drought-resistant crops we have is cassava and we have millet. But you realize most Africans will not prefer flour from cassava or millet. They'll prefer corn, that is maize, or any other as opposed to cassava and millet. And in essence, when we plant those crops which are not drought-resistant, when there's drought, they'll be destroyed. And in essence, we'll have food shortage in Africa. So that is another factor which leads to food shortage in Africa. And then the next one, we have poor and inadequate storage facilities. Poor and inadequate storage facilities. So in this case, what we refer is that the storage facilities that have been constructed by the government or invested on by the government are not enough. That means they are inadequate. And of course, some are poor. And we said, for example, in Kenya, in the year 2001, we lost up to 9 million bags of grain as a result of poor storage. So you realize that these grain were destroyed because the country has not invested much in constructing good and enough storage facilities, and that in essence leads to a shortage of food in Africa. The next one we talked about is poor transport network. Why? Because the transport leads to uneven distribution of food. So there are some places the government may not be able to reach. For example, maybe they want to give aid in terms of food. So you realize that they'll not be able to go to such places. Sometimes farmers are discouraged to produce. Reason, if they produce their products, they'll not be able to reach the market on time. And you realize some of the goods produced or some of the products from the farm are highly perishable. Talk about, for example, the crops like tomatoes. They're highly perishable. So if we have a poor transport network, they'll not be able to reach the market in good time. And that in essence will discourage farmers and will lead to shortage of food in Africa. Next one, over-reliance on aid. Over-reliance on aid. So Africans have been actually made to over-rely. Sorry, beg your pardon. Let me. Over-reliance. To over-rely is to over-depend. Over-reliance on aid. So Africans have relied too much. Actually, most of the African countries will rely, and this makes them to become complacent about looking for permanent solution. They'll become complacent. They'll not be able to work harder to look for permanent solutions. So you realize countries, maybe from Europe, maybe from America, they are ready to give aid in terms of food. And this in essence makes Africans complacent, not ready to work and look for permanent solution. And that will lead to shortage of food in Africa. Then we also talk about poor economic planning on the part of the government. Poor economic planning on the government. So you realize that the government will put much of its energy on how to put in place a lot of projects. And it's not bad to put projects, but there's what we call, putting first things first. So in that case, they are supposed to look on ways on how to control the projects and in essence put in place production of more food. So the poor economic planning should be dealt upon by the government to ensure that they put in place measures to produce more food as opposed to putting more projects which don't produce food for their citizens. So another factor which we can talk about is the HIV and AIDS pandemic. The HIV and AIDS pandemic. This has contributed to a greater percentage on food shortage in Africa. Why? HIV and AIDS pandemic. So you realize that this disease, HIV and AIDS pandemic, has killed a number of population. In this case, the most people which are affected are the people at their prime age, who are so productive in their brains and who are productive in terms of strength. So this population, which is supposed to assist their country in producing more food, they die at their prime age. And therefore that means that, the resource which you could have got from such kind of people goes to waste. And in essence, that leads to food shortage in Africa. So basically, those are some of the causes of food shortage in Africa which we can discuss about. Now, what are the effects? What are the effects? After discussing about the factors or the causes of food shortage, what are the effects of us lacking enough food? So we look at a subtopic, and that should be the effect of food shortages. What will happen if we don't have enough food? Yeah, food is important. So a larger population will not survive in areas without food. So the most common cause, let us talk about the effects. Effects of food shortages. So the first one is loss of life. There is loss of life. So when you talk about loss of life, many people will lose their lives. For example, in Ethiopia in the year 1984, in Ethiopia we had famine, and a lot of people, up to thousands of people, died as a result of a famine. Talk about our example, our country, Kenya. We've had many people dying in areas like Northeastern and areas like Samburu as a result of lack of food. So therefore, the most common one effect of lack of food shortage in Africa is loss of life. Many people will die as a result of lacking food. The next one, we talk about increased suffering. Increased suffering among many people due to diseases which are caused by deficiency. They're called deficiency diseases. So you realize that most people from the third world country are malnourished because they lack enough food. They lack balanced diet. So diseases like kwashiorkor, and talk about marasmus. So these are diseases which are called deficiency diseases. So you realize that the people from these who are in Africa are malnutritionized. They suffer from malnutrition as a result of lacking enough food. So that leads to increased suffering. It's not a very good picture to look at people who are malnourished. You realize there's not very disturbing kind of situation. You also realize that food shortage will lead to social problems or problems in the society. To social problems, or you can call them vices. Yeah. So you realize that most people will carry out things like cattle raids. You talk about, for example, the Maasai and the Karamojong during the peace of famine. They tend to carry out raiding in periods of famine. Even other social problems like stealing. Yeah. So talk about raiding, whereby you have one community raiding a neighboring community as a result of food shortage. Talk about stealing, whereby young people and even old will be caught stealing from other people as a result of lacking enough food. Talk about even prostitution. People will want to carry out prostitution to create income to buy food. Yeah. So these are social vices which are brought about as a result of food shortage in Africa. So that is another negative cause or effect of food shortage in Africa. And then it also brings about what you call refugee problems, brings about refugee problems. People will run away from their countries. Yeah, they will run away from their countries to find some aid in other countries. In Kenya, we have a refugee camp called Dadaab. People have come from different countries, and what they are looking for is food. They are looking for a place that is peaceful, that they can get enough food. So it brings about refugee problems, people running to other countries to receive some food in that case. So that brings about another negative effect of food shortage in Africa. So we also brings about a lack of economic development, or we can say it derails economic development. It slows down a population that is well fed works hard, but you realize a population which is not well fed, in essence, will become weak, because it is only when you've worked that you'll be able, actually when you've eaten, you will be able to efficiently work and produce more. So it will derail the economic development of such countries. And this in essence also will affect learners. It will affect learners. You realize that learners will not be able to go to class hungry. Yeah, it is not, you can't concentrate in a class with an empty stomach. It won't be easy. So therefore, it affects the education, because they can't concentrate. And that in essence will affect, it will affect the economy of a country, because you won't have enough learned population which will be able to take care of its country economically. Another one, it has led to over-dependence. It has led to what called depending on other countries which are rich. Yeah, so that is another negative effect. So we talk about over depending on rich countries for aid. Yeah, so countries that have shortage, like Africa, if there's shortage of food, it will really lead to depending so much on rich countries for production or for provision of food. And therefore, this will basically lead to complacency, which we talked about. People becoming lazy, not willing to work and bring about permanent solutions to the food problem. So that is another effect which we can talk about, is brought about by food shortage in Africa. And then it has also affected industrialization. Yeah, it has negatively affected growth of industries. Yeah, so you realize that in countries whereby we have enough agricultural activities taking place, we'll have more agro-based industries. But in a country whereby there is no, we don't have enough food, you realize that the rate at which industries are growing will go down, it will shrink. And in essence, you realize that such kind of a country will take long to industrialize. It will take long to industrialize. And eventually, this will lead to unemployment, because if we don't have enough industries, therefore we'll have a large population which is unemployed. Yeah. So if we have a large population which is unemployed, we lead to what we discussed about the social vices which take place in a community as a result of lack of enough food. So therefore, that is another negative effect which we can talk about, which comes as a result of food shortage in Africa. And lastly, it leads to what we call political instability. Political instability. How does it happen? That people, if people are hungry, they will lose confidence in their government. They lose confidence in the government which is in place, and that will lead actually to political instability. People will want to come out and riot. People will want to come out and rebel against the country, the government which is in place, which is supposed to cater for the needs of its citizens. So that is the last effect which we discuss about on the effects of food shortages in Africa. Therefore, it's important now we get to know that those are some of the causes, the effects. There are many, but for now we shall be able to measure on the ones which we discussed. We shall stop there for a short break, but we shall be back in a little while to look at the solutions, to propose the solutions the governments in Africa which they will take to solve the food problem in Africa. Keep tuned. See you shortly. Yeah, welcome back again to our second session of history, and I'm your teacher, Mr. Alex Obara, of course, and we are on looking at the food situation in Africa and the rest of the third world countries. And we discussed about the causes of food shortage and the effects of food shortage in Africa. Now, one of these fine days, probably you may be called in a session by the government and you'll be asked to propose some of the solutions which the third world countries, your country or Kenya, can put in place to solve the food problem in Africa. So we shall discuss about solutions to food shortages in Africa. Solutions which are some of the proposals, or which are some of the actions the government should put in place so that to ensure that we deal with the problem of food shortage in Africa. So in this session, we shall look and discuss in detail and see some of those solutions which the government and the people of Africa ought to put in place so as to solve the problem of food shortage. So the first solution which the government can do is to reclaim land reclamation. Yeah, so to reclaim land, for example, we talk about land which was initially productive, and as a result of some human activities, this land became unproductive. That land can be reclaimed. So therefore, if it's reclaimed, it can be put under agriculture. So if you realize, for example, in some place we had mining activities, such a land can be reclaimed. If we talk about maybe areas which are swampy, such a land can be reclaimed, for example, by planting trees. So we can be able to reclaim that land which was initially productive and now not productive. Maybe sometimes the government has put so much land on cash crop. So such land can be reclaimed and more food can be planted in such a case so that to increase food in Africa. So the first solution which you can propose to Africa and the rest of the third world is to put land, to reclaim it so that it can produce more. Number two, to put in place policies that will aid to shift from cash crop production to food production. to food crops. So the government can put in place so that they can pay more attention on food crops. You realize that the government has put more attention on cash crop. They put more attention on tea, more attention on coffee, more attention on tobacco, but they have not put enough attention on food crops like maize, for example. So therefore, the government can shift now, put in place policies, all guidelines and laws which will now assist the country so that it can be able to plant more food crops as opposed to planting more cash crop. So it can bring that paradigm shift from cash crop to food crop production if policies are put in place to assist the people. Number 3, we can talk of provision of extension services to farmers. Provision of extension services to farmers. For example, they can be able to be given information on how they can store their products. They can be given information on how to preserve the produce. They can be given information on how to plant and produce more. So those are extension services which the government can freely offer to the farmers. So they can go to the local, to the interiors and find those small-scale farmers, find those large-scale farmers